Celia Thaxter grew up on the Isles of Shoals, the lighthouse keeper's daughter who became one of New England's most celebrated poets. She hosted a famous literary circle at her family's hotel on Appledore Island, and she created a garden that people still remember today. But in 1875, Thaxter published something very different from her poems and garden writing, an essay called A Memorable Murder. It was her account of a double murder that happened almost at her doorstep on a neighboring island in the winter of 1873. This is that story, and it belongs to the women who lived it. Smuttynose Island is one of the Isles of Shoals, a cluster of rocky islands off the coast of New Hampshire and southern Maine. It's far enough out to sea that the mainland disappears on a hazy day. Smuttynose itself is part of Kittery, Maine, windswept, treeless, surrounded by cold Atlantic water. And in the winter of 1873, it was home to exactly one occupied house. Now, in that house lived John and Maren Hampshire, Norwegian immigrants who had made a life on Smuttynose. John ran a successful fishing operation and by 1872 had brought family over from Norway. His brother Matthew, Maren's brother Ivan, also called Evan, and Ivan's young wife Anethe, and Maren's older sister Karen, who had recently been working at the Appledore Hotel. The household was full of people who had crossed an ocean to build something and who were beginning slowly to build it. Celia Thaxter knew these women. She had met Maren the first time Maren brought her sister Karen to Appledore, and she never forgot it. She was struck by what she described as Maren's beautiful behavior, her gentleness and intelligence, the gray eyes full of light. Karen was Maren's older sister, and she had a quiet sadness about her that Thaxter noticed. She had lost a lover in Norway long before and carried the grief of it privately. She had been working at the Appledore Hotel for 2 years and had only just returned to Smuttynose, sleeping on a makeshift bed near the kitchen stove since she no longer had her room at the hotel. She was between things, figuring out what came next. Thaxter had often watched her, sitting by the fire in her blue Norwegian dress, spinning at the wheel she had brought from home, and singing old Norwegian songs softly to herself, entirely unaware she was being observed. Anethe was Ivan's wife, young, fair, merry, with bright sunny hair, so long it reached nearly to her knees when unbraided. She and Ivan had married at Christmas in Norway just over a year before and had come to America together full of hope for a life that was still just beginning. She had not been on Smuttynose long enough to feel entirely settled. She was still learning the shape of her new world. Maren was the one who held the household together. She had come to Smuttynose with John when they were young, and she knew every inch of the island, the rocks, the weather, the rhythms of the fishing seasons. She told Thaxter just days after the night of March 5th, "I never was so happy in my life as when we were all living there together." But on the night of March 5th, 1873, the men were all in Portsmouth, delayed overnight because the bait train from Boston was running late. The house on Smuttynose held the three women, the little dog Ringe, and the darkness of a bitter winter night. A man named Louis Wagner knew that. Louis Wagner was German-born, often described in contemporary accounts as Prussian. He had come to America around the same time as the Hampshires and had worked for John Hampshire for about 2 years, living in the house on Smuttynose, eating at the family table. He knew the island, he knew the household, and he knew the people who lived there. By March 1873, Wagner was desperate. He had been let go after more family arrived from Norway, and he was living in Portsmouth on the waterfront. He was behind on rent, he was wearing worn clothes, with little money and no prospects. And then he heard that John Hampshire said that he had been saving about $600 toward a new boat. 3 times that evening, Wagner asked John and the other men whether they planned to return to Smuttynose that night. He already knew the answer. He needed only to confirm it. Around 8 o'clock, he stole a small dory from Pickering Wharf in Portsmouth, and he rowed out into the dark. 10 miles of water, hours at the oars, bitter March air and a rising moon. Thaxter would later write that nature itself seemed to play into his hands that night. The first calm night of the early spring, fair tide, fair wind, just enough moonlight. She had looked out at the same sky that evening and rejoiced at the stillness. He landed on the south side of the island and made his way to the only occupied house. The kitchen door creaked as he opened it. The dog Ringe barked. Karen woke first on her makeshift bed by the stove. She thought it was John coming home, the most natural assumption in the world, the sound of the door, a man's shape in the dark. "John, is that you?" she called. In the next room, Maren tried to open the bedroom door and found it locked. Wagner had pushed a stick through it over the latch. She could hear Karen screaming in the other room. When Karen fell against the door, it gave way. Maren rushed out, seized her sister, and dragged her back into the bedroom. Wagner followed and struck Maren 3 times with a chair. Hard enough, Thaxter said, to have killed her if there had been light enough to aim. Maren got Karen inside and held the door shut. All this time, Anethe lay motionless in the dark, paralyzed with fear. Maren called to her through the window, "Get out, run, hide." Anethe climbed out through the low window and stood outside in the freezing snow in a single garment, barefoot, unable to make a sound, unable to move, terrified. Wagner left off trying to force the door and went outside. He came around the corner of the house and confronted Anethe where she stood. The moonlight was full in his face. She recognized him and cried out his name, "Louis, Louis, Louis!" He went back to the front door where Maren had left an axe the day before after chopping ice from the well. He returned to Anethe with it. Maren stood at the window and watched. There was nothing she could do. When Wagner went back inside, Maren understood that her sister Karen could not be saved. She wrapped a skirt around her shoulders, she climbed out through the window and ran, barefoot, across the frozen ground, over Anethe's body in the snow, into the darkness of the island. The dog, Ringe, pressed so close to her feet as she ran that she fell over him more than once. She hid among the icy rocks at the water's edge, face down through the remaining hours of the night. She heard Karen's final screams. There was silence, only the sound of the water and the wind. Wagner searched the island for Maren and did not find her. He washed at the island well, leaving bloody towels behind. He tore through the house, looking for the $600 he had rowed 10 miles to steal, and he found only $15. Several $100 lay folded in a drawer he had opened and searched without finding them. He dragged Anethe's body inside from the doorstep. He sat down at the kitchen table and ate the food he had brought with him from Portsmouth. Then he rowed back to the mainland before dawn. Back in Portsmouth, he went to the boarding house where he had been living and crept upstairs to change out of the clothes he had worn on the island. Then he came back downstairs, and that is where the composure broke. The man who had rowed 10 miles in the dark and killed 2 women and eaten breakfast at the scene, washed his hands at the well, and rowed back, that man could not sit at a boarding room house table for 20 minutes. He appeared before the Johnson family, anxious, frightened, agitated. He told them he had never felt so badly in his life. He told them he had gotten into trouble and was afraid he would be taken. He couldn't eat. He said, "Farewell forever," to people he boarded with. And then he walked out the door, found a barber to change his appearance, and took the train to Boston, where he bought himself an entirely new outfit, clothes, shoes, a complete change. And then he lingered. Thaxter's word for it is exact. He was held by fate. He could not make himself run. Before the evening was out, an officer's hand was on his shoulder. He was arrested in Boston on March 7th. On Smuttynose, as the light came up, Maren made her painful way across the breakwater toward the neighboring island and called for help until someone finally heard her. Her feet were torn from the rocks and ice. Her face carried the bruise of the blow Wagner had struck. When Thaxter arrived at her side, Maren seized her hands and said, "Oh, I am so glad to see you. I'm so glad I saved my life." And then she told Thaxter everything, holding her with what Thaxter described as wild, glittering, dilated eyes, unable to tell the story fast enough. She named Louis Wagner. She had heard Anethe cry out his name in the moonlight. She had known him for 2 years. Her testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution, clear and consistent, and the jury deliberated for less than an hour. She and John moved to Portsmouth after the murders with the little dog Ringe, who had pressed so close to her feet as she fled across the frozen island that she had fallen over him more than once, and who had nestled against her through all the long hours she lay hidden among the rocks. Thaxter mentions him at the end of her essay, still with them in their new life in Portsmouth. He made it through the night, too. They never returned to Smuttynose. Ivan Christensen had been in Portsmouth with John on the night of the murders. He came back to Smuttynose to find his new wife dead. Both he and John staggered out of the house and fell senseless in the snow. A few weeks later, Ivan came to Appledore and asked for work. That much he could do. After that, he never volunteered a word. Thaxter watched him every day, with his head bowed, pushing the plane, driving the saw, never raising his eyes. She wanted to speak to him, but stopped herself each time. He seemed to me, she wrote, to be hurt too sorely to be touched by human hand. When he finally did speak, unprompted, it was to say only that he believed it had been meant to be, that fate had arranged everything. The calm night, the fair wind, the axe beside the door. It was to have been, he said. It had so been ordered. At the end of the summer, he returned alone to Norway. He was never heard from again. Louis Wagner was tried in Alfred, Maine. The case against him was built on Maren's identification and a web of circumstantial evidence. The hours he could not account for, the $15 he suddenly had after being nearly penniless, the blisters on his hands from a night at the oars, his detailed knowledge of the island and household, the bloody towels at the well, large boot prints in the snow across Smuttynose, and testimony that he had known about John Hauntbit's savings. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial and to the end. His last words on the gallows were, "I am innocent." He was hanged on June 25th, 1875, at Thomaston, Maine State Prison. The Portsmouth Athenaeum now holds the axe associated with the Smuttynose murders. Celia Thaxter wrote her essay because she felt the world had missed the point. The newspapers had published every gruesome detail for months. What they had not published, she said, was this. The world does not know how gentle a life these poor people led, how innocently happy were their quiet days. She knew those days. She had watched Karen spin at her wheel by the fire in her blue Norwegian dress, singing old songs softly to herself. She had met Anethe, young and fair and full of hope, married only since Christmas, still new to this cold island, still becoming herself. And she had held Maren's hands in the days after, listening to her tell the story with those wild, glittering eyes. Anethe was buried in her wedding dress, the blue dress she had worn at Christmas in Norway just over a year before, when her whole life was still ahead of her. Thaxter did not end her essay with the verdict. She ended it on the island. She imagined Wagner's ghost, still prowling the rocks of Smuttynose, moving through the old houses, searching the shore, circling the black water, searching for the woman who had escaped him, whom he never, never, never can find, she wrote, though his distracted spirit may search till man shall vanish from off the face of the earth. That was her justice, not the gallows. Maren escaped beyond his reach forever. But Thaxter did one more thing. She put their names on the page. She gave Karen and Anethe and Maren back their lives before the night of March 5th. The blue dress, the spinning wheel, the songs by the fire, the happiness. She made sure the world would know not just what was done to them, but who they were. That is what a memorable murder means. Not sensational, not forgotten, remembered by name. And we have tried to do the same thing here. I'll see you again somewhere in time.